Hi there. Come on in. It's time for the meeting of the Practical Sportsman's Club. It's Thursday night. We're in the year 2000, January 20th. We just completed a big meeting up in Ithaca. I don't want to show you the tape right now because a lot of people wonder, anybody show up? Well, let me just say, yes, they did. I'll show you that in a moment. We're going to talk about DNR Deer Numbers, where they come from, why hunters are skeptical, have a guide report, ice conditions around the state, and a lot more. So you stay tuned. I'm Fred Trost. You're watching The Practical Sportsman. Well, we had our big meeting up in Ithaca. Going to show you some clips from that in just a moment. But what this meeting was all about basically was deer hunting, the deer hunting numbers, the regulations, the unlimited doe permits and fawn permits. And it just so happens that the Woods and Waters News had an article. Tom Campbell wrote an editorial in here, says 99 deer kill lower but expected. In other words, the DNR expected to have a little lower deer kill this year. Now already at the end of the season they've popped out with the numbers, and this is what they said, that there were 340,000 deer killed during firearm deer season, 184,000 antlered, 156,000 antlerless. Now they do a postcard survey sometime in the spring, which usually verifies is within a few percent of their estimate from the deer season. But Tom Campbell here made what I would consider the understatement of the new millennium, I guess we'll call it. He said the deer kill numbers supplied by the DNR have a tendency to upset some hunters because they just don't feel they're accurate. Well, that's an understatement. I mean, some hunters, we had an auditorium full at the Ithaca High School. When I say full, they told us that if we pulled out all the bleachers and everything, we could fit 3,000 people in there. Well, that auditorium was packed. These hunters, I think you can describe as ones who have a tendency to be upset because they just don't feel these deer numbers are accurate in the regulations. See, Tom Campbell also reported here, he says, the fact is decisions about hunting seasons, limits, permits, and so forth are based on these findings. So these numbers that they come out with result in decisions about the hunting seasons and so on. Now, if you're not a hunter, you might say, hey, I mean, what's the big deal? What's there to contest about this? Well, in the article, and I've seen the same quote in other publications, Tom Campbell wrote here how the DNR comes up with this number right on the heels of deer season. Now listen to this. This is why hunters are skeptical. The DNR says the number is estimated from a survey of southbound traffic during the 16-day firearm deer season. Trained observers located at strategic locations on the state's major highways record the number of vehicles that pass by with harvested deer visible during each day. Now, I mean, consider this. We're talking southbound highways. So we're talking I-75. What else goes south? I mean, 131, US 23, I don't know. So on these highways, we have trained observers who are recording the vehicles that pass by with deer that you can see. I mean, how many people in this day and age, when it's politically incorrect to, have deer showing on your car, how many people do that? And see, this is one reason hunters are saying, how does this work? Well, what about the people who put the deer inside their cars? Well, this is covered. It says DNR-operated highway deer check stations provide additional information on the ratio of visible, not visible deer coming through these stations. Okay, now how many check stations are we talking? A few? How often are they open during that 16-day season? A lot of times I've driven by them and they're closed. But anyway, so they apply that ratio to the observed visible deer. And then what do they do with it? How do they get 340,000? Quote, this data is incorporated into mathematical models that provide estimates of harvest for the Upper Peninsula and Northern Lower Peninsula. Now, these mathematical models are also something that some hunters tend to be skeptical about. In fact, Paul Schuster, who's our guide report source up there at Houghton at Dick's Favorite Sports, he was talking about the mathematical models, about how they've been applied to the moose and the deer up in his area, and he says, whoa, these are questionable.
Using their probability and statistics mathematics. Maybe to generalize the UP deer herd, maybe it works okay. But to be specific on how many deer are available to shoot, say in County, there's just no way that math works. This is the same math that they used to determine that they're all going to have a moose season in this upcoming season. They figured we had 500 moose, and when they did a real count, figured we only had 50. So if the math is that bad, it's that bad for deer too.
You see why hunters are skeptical? In fact, I got digging around into the clippings that I saved. This one is from the 31st of December, 1997. It was in the Detroit News. It says, the aerial survey of moose planned. It said, a year after an aerial survey turned up a lower moose population than expected, the State Department of Natural Resources is returning to the skies for a similar survey. And this was, remember, 1997, and the local biologist up there said, we're seeing more moose than last year. We are encouraged. So now, how did that turn out? I got the clipping from 1998, from the 1st of March, from the Lansing State Journal. It said, moose numbers not as expected. The DNR's aerial survey of Upper Peninsula moose herd is completed, and the results were startling. Startling results, even to the Lansing State Journal. Estimated at about 450 moose, the survey showed the herd is actually a fraction of that, about 120 moose. So we're talking about an error here on a small amount of animals. And you apply this factor, the ratio, the rest of the state for deer, we're talking about a big one. And so what about this discrepancy? I love this quote from the Lansing State Journal. DNR officials and biologists say that the discrepancies in the estimated population is a dilemma that many wildlife agencies face. No kidding. A bit of a dilemma. When it's that bad on moose, what about the deer? Well, what could be done about this? What could be done about maybe a little better way of surveying? Tom Campbell says in Woods and Waters News, he says, about the only way to squelch this controversy is to have a mandatory check-in of all deer killed. True, that's one way of doing it, and a lot of hunters think that should be done. But I talked to Bob Lucina, who has reported on the show before. He's a deer processor in Ovid. He's been a deer processor for a number of years. Many deer processors in the state, they butcher most of the deer that most hunters have. Here's what Bob Lucina said about the deer count.
And I've been doing this for like 12, 13 years, and not anybody that's affiliated with the DNR has walked in here or sent me a letter saying, how many deer did you process? So where are these getting these figures from? Nobody's ever contacted me. None. So I have no idea where they're getting this big deer kill. And if you listen to the hunters that come in, it's not from the hunters killing them, that's for sure.
Just at every turn, hunters see ways that deer could be counted. Mandatory counts, checking the deer processors. But this deal of observing the highways north and the southbound traffic, I mean, come on. This is why the deer kill numbers supplied by the DNR have a tendency to upset some hunters because they just don't feel they're accurate. Hunters feel they have things to say, things to offer, observations, what they've seen in the field. And the DNR has been telling hunters that they really don't know what they're talking about. Well, if that's true, that hunters shouldn't have an input into the regulations, then why is it on July 11th in the Detroit News, on the outdoor page, the DNR asked people for help on their observations? It says, seen a moose? Anyone who sees a moose or finds moose tracks in the Upper Peninsula is being asked by the DNR to report that information. I mean, so here the DNR is asking for a little help. And the biologist up there at Crystal Falls said, this information is important because it indicates the presence of moose in a general area, and that helps us improve our data and research operations. Once again, let me show you 3,000 hunters in an auditorium who are upset with the deer numbers, who feel their observations are valid and feel they have not been given an opportunity to present their observations and actually what amounts to some pretty serious field study to the DNR for the deer regulations. That's why they're asking the Administrative Procedures Act be changed by the legislature to provide public hearings in advance so we can give the DNR not only moose information on seeing tracks and spotting moose, but with the deer as well. What I'm going to do, though, based on what we learned here about how the DNR counts the deer with their trained observers, I'm going to do a Freedom of Information Act request sent to the DNR to find the documents, to find out what documents they have to train observers, to find out where these strategic locations are and what are the major highways. And I want to see the paperwork during that 16-day period that has been filled out by these trained observers so we can see how this number is computed. Now, that's something that I hope to have here maybe in a week or two back, and I will report that. But I tell you, the understatement of the millennium, of the new millennium, that some hunters are upset because they just don't feel the deer numbers are accurate. Whoa, that's a corker. Now let me just take a minute to just give you a nutshell capsule of what went on at that meeting up in Ithaca on Sunday night.
Okay. Right? Yeah, right behind you guys. Just save me a nice cushion chair. Save me some.
Here we were, 7 o'clock Sunday evening, January 16th, Ithaca High School, a gymnasium full of hunters who were concerned about the future of hunting and fishing if things continue going like they are. This movement was the idea of Randy Smith in the brown and Richard Heathcock on the other side of him. Before the meeting started, they were talking with Senator Mike Goshka from Gratiot and Saginaw counties. 3 state representatives were in the audience. Representative Rick Johnson from Wexford, Missaukee, Roscommon, and Osceola counties. Representative Larry Julian from Shiawassee County, and Representative Tony Stamos from Midland County. These were their constituents, hunters, voters, concerned citizens. They came here to learn about DNR regulations, how they're made, why they're so complicated, why they're changed so frequently, and why sometimes they just don't seem to reflect common sense. The gymnasium was full of people from diverse backgrounds and experiences, but one thing was for sure. All of them want to see a change in how DNR regulations are made. They want public hearings in advance so citizens have a real opportunity for input. We all hope that this grassroots showing of support will lead to change and a better future for hunting and fishing in Michigan. Last week he was finishing up the buck that you saw him mounting on Big Buck Night. Believe it or not, the last step in the process is applying furniture polish, not just to the rack, but to the hair.
It'll help smooth the hair out on it too. Makes it really nice and slick and sleek looking. You've got any little hair sticking up, it lays them right down into place.
Oh, we have a lot of activities coming up, a lot of fun things. I'm sure there's more meetings of the Whitetails Forever Network. Get on our website. I'll have more information on there about how you can become involved and where this is going. But I just have to bring up, there were so many good quotes in tonight's news. I think my favorite one, though, I got to go with this one from the Lansing State Journal. DNR officials and biologists say the discrepancies in the estimated population is a dilemma that many wildlife agencies face. I guess so. That dilemma is something that sportsmen, many of them who came to the meeting up in Ithaca, feel we must get a handle on. We're working towards it. I have that Freedom of Information Act request filed. We're moving ahead with trying to get hearings, public hearings in the DNR rulemaking process. So a lot of things are happening, but don't worry about that all the time. Make sure you get out ice fishing, get out rabbit hunting, get outdoors. It's a great place to be. I'll see you next week. These were their constituents, hunters, voters, concerned citizens. They came here to learn about DNR regulations, how they're made, why they're so complicated, why they're changed so frequently, and why sometimes they just don't seem to reflect common sense. The gymnasium was full of people from diverse backgrounds and experiences, but one thing was for sure. All of them want to see a change in how DNR regulations are made. They want public hearings in advance so citizens have a real opportunity for input. We all hope that this grassroots showing of support will lead to change and a better future for hunting and fishing in Michigan.